All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Chad Blackman podcast. This podcast is all about helping you know, love, and defend the word. In today's episode, I want to handle an issue that is very popular on social media right now. This is making the rounds on TikTok. It is the objection to Christianity that Christians pick and choose certain laws from the Old Testament, that we love to just isolate certain rules to follow, and then we totally neglect other laws. I am excited to try and tackle this issue with you. Let's get after it. All right, there is a very popular video going around right now on TikTok, and if you haven't seen this specific video, you've probably seen one that is similar to it. And here's kind of the summary of this video. It's this girl who's raising an objection to Christianity. She's saying that the Bible in the Old Testament talks about how homosexuality is prohibited. It is not God's original design for human sexuality. And she is right in saying that. And then what she does is she kind of flips the script and she says, well, Leviticus also says that you're not to trim the edge of your beard, you're not to eat shellfish, lobster, shrimp, you're not to eat bacon, you're not to eat any kind of pork, you're not to wear clothes of mixed fibers, you're not to plant different seeds, mix different seeds in your field. And her point here is, why do you focus so much on the homosexual prohibitions in Leviticus and then completely neglect these other aspects of the law? And what she's doing here is pointing out what she thinks is an apparent contradiction in our consistency. She's basically pointing out, you Christians are hypocrites. You hammer down on this one thing, but then you completely neglect all these other aspects of the law. Now, if you haven't seen this or you haven't bumped into this objection, I promise you it is only going to become more and more popular of an objection. The reason why it's going to become more popular is because a lot of Christians don't know how to answer it. A lot of Christians get caught on their heels. They get caught not knowing how to respond to this. So here's what I wanted to do today is try to answer, why does it seem like Christians pick and choose which laws they follow? Why does it seem like we still take some of the Old Testament laws and hold them up as valid, but then other ones we don't hold them up as valid? Well, to answer this question, it's helpful to know about different types of law in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, especially the first 5 books of the Bible, you're going to see 3 different types of law. There's civil law, there's ceremonial law, and then there's moral law. Civil law is how the nation of Israel was to govern itself. Those laws and rules were given specifically for the nation of Israel. The ceremonial law was given specifically to the nation of Israel, and it regulated how the Jews were to worship God. Then you have the moral law. The moral law is given to the nation of Israel, and you see throughout the Old Testament what God holds all of the nations accountable to is the moral law. He holds everyone, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians. He holds everybody accountable to the moral law. He does not hold them accountable to the civil or the ceremonial law. Now, to be fair, there is sometimes a little bit of bleed over from like civil law into moral law, because people say you can't legislate morality. That's ridiculous. That's exactly what law is. That's what we're trying to legislate. We're trying to put into effect what is good and moral for a society. So sometimes you're going to see some of those civil laws have moral implications. Even some of the ceremonial laws. Sometimes the ceremonial laws are deeper than just purely ritualistic, robotic expressions. There's deeper moral attributes to them. But for the most part, we can think of Old Hebrew law in those 3 categories: civil, ceremonial, and moral. Now, this raises the question, which laws are still applicable to us today, and why does it seem like some Christians follow aspects of the Old Testament, but not other aspects? Okay, well, first of all, like I said earlier, what we see God hold all the nations accountable to is the moral law. So the simplest, clearest expression of the moral law would be the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments really can stand alone. Like, this is God's standard of morality. And from that Ten Commandments, we can start to kind of see the moral law and see how there's some moral implications in other aspects of the civil and ceremonial law. Okay? So when we think then in the New Testament, what do we still follow? Well, first and foremost, the moral laws of God have not changed. And certain aspects of morality are involved in things like human sexuality, because the way that we interact with one another is civil to some extent, but really there's deeper moral issues happening there. In fact, Jesus will say that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so how do we love our neighbor well? Well, it comes in all kinds of different fashions and expressions, and one of those specifically has to do with avoiding sexual immorality. Jesus very clearly in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 19, he says Moses only permitted divorce because your hearts were hard. He says, don't let anyone separate what God has joined together, this sacred institution of marriage. And he's speaking to Jewish people. He clearly says here that to avoid sexual immorality is one of the best ways that you can love your fellow neighbor. And when he uses that term sexual immorality in Matthew 19, it is the word porneia. It's kind of a junk drawer sexual immorality term. It refers to every form of sexual immorality the Jews would have known in the Old Testament, which includes homosexuality. So this is why Christians now looking into the New Testament will go, well, Jesus affirmed biblical marriage. He affirmed marriage between one man and one woman. And he affirms that in the aspect of morality, but also in the aspect of civility. Like, this is how you create a good society. This is how you love your neighbors well. It's by being devoted to your wife, not practicing sexual immorality, not being given over to sexual sin, not being given over to covetousness. This is how you love one another well. Then, especially when we get to like some of the food prohibitions, clearly in Acts chapter 10, in Acts chapter 15, the new church starts wrestling with the fact it seems like God is very clearly telling this new church who's got a ton of Jews and a ton of Gentiles, he's saying to them, listen, don't call any of the foods you used to call unclean, don't call them unclean. They're now clean. Which meant, hey, you can have all the shrimp and all the lobster and all the bacon and all the sausage you want now. Because Jesus points out it's not the food that goes into you that defiles you. It's what comes up out of your heart. It's what comes up out of your heart that makes you unclean. So he goes, listen, man, there's nothing inherently sinful about having a BLT. It doesn't make you a sinner. And so Acts 10, I mean, we clearly see God saying in this new covenant, there's now no food restrictions anymore. There's now no prohibitions here anymore. And then when we start looking at a lot of these other Old Testament, especially some of the ceremonial laws, what we see is that Christ was the fulfillment of all those laws. That a lot of the stuff, the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament, a lot of those were like this little foreshadowing of Christ to come. They were a little picture of Jesus to come. So when the Old Testament says, don't wear clothes of mixed fibers, why did it say that? Well, in the New Testament, Christians will say we are clothed in the perfect righteousness of Christ. That like one of the essential truths of the gospel is that Christ has taken off of us our sin and condemnation. He bore it in his body on the cross, and he has now given to us his imputed perfect righteousness. So we are clothed in his perfection. So the Old Testament picture then was wear these clothes that they have these pure fabrics. There's no mixed fibers in there, because that's a little mini picture of us being clothed in the righteousness of Christ. All the ceremonial regulations on sacrifices, those are all little mini pictures about how Christ would be the ultimate sacrifice for us. all of these ceremonial regulations about giving drink offerings to the Lord. Christ would then culminate all those drink offerings in the new covenant when he takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood poured out for you in the new covenant." Right? So for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Jews are just pouring out wine. And ultimately Jesus goes, okay, now it's reached its finality. Now I am the fulfillment of all that. The Jews used to go into the outer room of the tabernacle or temple, and they'd always bring the showbread. They'd put new bread in there all the time, constantly putting new bread in there. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the fulfillment of that. I am what that bread you put in and out of the temple all day, every day, for years and years and years. I'm the fulfillment of that. And this is a whole rabbit hole. I mean, we could go really deep down this field of study, but basically all that stuff is foreshadowing and picturing Christ to come. And so when Jesus then lives his life and dies on the cross and resurrects, those things have now passed away because Christ has fulfilled them. Those things now have their culmination in Christ. The whole priestly system having this intermediary between us and God, Jesus is now that perfect high priest for us. He took on flesh just like us, felt what we felt, tempted like we are tempted, and yet was without sin. And he's now our high priest. Like so many of these pictures in the Old Testament showing what Christ would ultimately do. And now that he's done them, those things are no longer binding for us. Those things are no longer important or not important. That's not the right way to say it. But those things are just no longer like binding or necessary for us to do. So hopefully that makes sense. So if I had to kind of clear this up and say it as simply and succinctly as I can. Why does it seem like we pick and choose? Well, the truth is we do pick and choose, but we pick and choose with a clear standard. We pick and choose based upon what Jesus has told us to pick and choose. We pick and choose based upon what the apostles of the New Testament have told us to pick and choose. And what we see is that the moral law of God has not passed away in any shape or form. We are still very much accountable to the moral law. And there are certain civil laws that interact with the moral law of God that the New Testament is going to still say, hey, this is still morally binding on you. And when it comes then to the ceremonial law, almost all of the ceremonial law has had its fulfillment now in Christ. And eventually one day all of that will have its perfect total fulfillment in Christ. And so this is why we pick and choose. We pick and choose because Christ has fulfilled the ceremonial law. There's no more of that to necessarily practice and follow. He is our fulfillment of it. We follow the moral law, and we follow certain aspects of that civil law that the apostles and Christ have showed us clearly. This is still binding. This is still authoritative for your life. So hopefully that makes sense. This is a question that's not going anywhere. And I pray that this would be a helpful resource to you or to somebody who might be struggling with this question. So thank you. Thank you for checking this out. I love you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'll see you on the next one.